talk about civic participation and immigration 100 years ago, that my grandfather came here about 100 years ago, got off the boat in Galveston, Texas, got sent up on a train to Kansas City, and the Teddy Pendergast political urban ethnic machine, political urban ethnic, that's not a technical term, but the urban political machine took him off the train and into the voting booth, and as they said then, as they do in Chicago, vote early and often. And some years later, they saw fit to make him a citizen. Now, that's not exactly the textbook way that we think about immigration and citizenship in our history. But I think it's a good way of beginning to think about different perspectives on immigration and citizenship. I'm often reminded when I am asked to speak about immigration, not only of that story, but about an old New Yorker cartoon, which shows two pilgrims getting off the boat, and one turns to the other and he says, well, in the short run, I'm here for religious freedom, but in the long run, I'm looking to get into real estate. And I actually think there's something absolutely right about that kind of story, because it suggests that immigration to any country, and particularly to this country, is a combination of high politics and religious fervor, and at the same time, very practical interests. It's about aspirations, and it's about self-interest. And I think we ought to bear in mind both those dimensions, because when we try and make it only about one or only about the other, we run the risk of trying to square the circle in a way that just isn't true to our history, to our people, and to our current needs. Now, let me give you an example of that. Today's debate over immigration, as you've been hearing all day, really revolves around three different kinds of issues. The first is the issue of enforcement, border enforcement, and undergirding that is the notion that if the rule of law means anything, you have to enforce the laws you have on the books. There's a second dimension, of course, which is proposals for guest worker policies. And here the emphasis is not on the rule of law, it's on economics, the economic needs of not so much immigrants in this case, though it may fit, but those who advocate that these are needs that we have in this country. There's a third strand, though, and this is the strand not over enforcement, not over guest workers, but over legalization or amnesty to the estimated 11 or 12 million illegal aliens currently in this country. There are a lot of different ideas that undergird those debates, but in particular I would single out an emphasis on individual and human rights. And so you have a complicated story here. You've got law, you've got economics, you've got rights. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that it's hard to put all these together in any neat kind of way. But what I would say to you today is what is most astonishing to me, having watched the immigration debate now for 15 years in this country, what's most astonishing to me is, given all those different perspectives and issues, how much everybody has suddenly agreed. Everyone has agreed that the problem is about illegal immigration. And this is one of these ways of trying to cut the Gordian knot, trying to simplify the story, that I think is too easy. It is, as they say, neat, convenient, and wrong. The focus on illegal immigration needs to be broadened. It needs to be broadened just because if you think about the distinction between illegal and legal immigrants, either from the perspectives of those coming or those already here, it gets actually pretty blurry when you look more closely. After all, many illegals arrive here legally and overstay their visas. Families often have legal and illegal immigrants in their very same household. And if illegal immigrants, who put up with a great deal of hardship and difficulty, but if they are so in the shadows, why is it that the labor unions in this country are resurgent based on the work of illegal immigration? You can see that in the Service Workers Union, you can see that across Los Angeles. It's not so easy to separate legal and illegal. And in fact, if you look at the concerns that many native-born citizens have when they articulate what they're worried about when it comes to immigration, it's actually blurred as well. What do people say? Immigrants are taking some jobs. They're crowding schools and emergency rooms. They're disturbing neighborhoods. They don't want to learn English. That isn't something, those concerns aren't concerns that you can simply split down the middle and say that's only about illegal immigrants. There's a larger story here about immigration. And in fact, I think it's a story that goes beyond legal and illegal. it goes to what immigration has come to represent for many people in this country. And that, I think, is the human face of two broad changes that have been taking place in our lives and our world that have nothing to do with immigration. The first is captured in the Harvard social scientist Robert Putnam's well-known book and research agenda, Bowling Alone. That Americans, he says, used to belong to PTAs and bowling leagues and all kinds of civic society organizations. And today, if we go bowling, we bowl alone. We don't have a lot of time for all those mediating institutions that stand between us and the abstract notion of the government. And for many Americans, quite separate from immigration, they articulate concerns that their community, their sense of community, is fraying around them. And as they articulate these concerns, they also sense something else, and that is that we are losing control increasingly over the forces that govern our lives. Think about this just in economic terms. When economic policy can be set not simply at the local, state, or national level, but increasingly is set by transnational corporations and by global political institutions, I'm thinking here of the European Union, you may think of NAFTA or other efforts in that regard. When communication and transportation is such that it is possible to say we increasingly live in a global network, in a global neighborhood, I think many Americans are increasingly unsure about who is here and about the nature of their community, and if it's possible, as it increasingly is, to be both here and there, to have a bank account in Bonn and a business in Tuscany. Actually, you should do it the other way around, probably. Or to live, as many legal and illegal immigrants do, in a kind of transnational network where they come and go and where they stay connected through the internet and cell phones back home in a way that wasn't possible 100 years ago. What all this means to a lot of Americans, I think, is if you're here and there, will it increasingly mean that you are neither here nor there? And immigration, as I say, has become the human face of this phenomenon of transience and a loss of control and bowling alone in the fraying of our community. Many Americans, I submit to you, and many immigrants as well, have become increasingly confused about what the bargain is. You go into any community, any society, any club, any university, any country, and you know that there are rules for belonging. Sometimes they're written down, sometimes they're not. There are expectations that are set. And I think a great deal of what is driving immigration politics and concern in this country is not just the long list of security or economic or cultural issues we can identify, but in fact is a sense that we just don't know how we're supposed to relate to each other and what we're supposed to expect of each other. And you can see this because if you ask Americans, they will articulate concerns not just about who is coming to this country today, but about what they are becoming. In other words, one of the driving forces of our debate over immigration today is about that age-old question, who are we? What does it mean to be an American? What are the goals we have for immigrants coming to this country? What do we expect and what do we provide? And the difficulty here is not simply, as it's often said, that we are divided amongst ourselves, that one side has one view and another side has another view about what that bargain should be. There is that to a degree, but immigration always makes strange bedfellows. No, I think what is most difficult for us today is that our own core sense of our identity and our values means that many of us, in fact, are divided within ourselves. Think about this. When there was the brouhaha several months ago over the Star-Spangled Banner and whether it could be sung in Spanish. Well, on the one hand, there's a strong, powerful sense of belonging, of identity, of language, is that what cements us as a people. And on the other hand, we have a long and proud tradition of civil liberties and individual rights. How do we reconcile those? Or think about the current debate from enforcement to guest workers to illegal immigration. On the one hand, we believe, or I think we ought to believe, deeply in the rule of law. On the other hand, many of us are compassionate. We are compassionate about the lives and the hardships of people who come here and the difficulties they come through. And we wonder and we worry about how to manage that balance. Or take even something like fairness. Right? This should be easy. Let's just have a fair policy. Well, the dilemma there is fairness toward whom? Right? Toward immigrants? Toward citizens? How about to immigrants who are patiently waiting in line? Fairness toward whom? So I think part of the dilemma we have in working through our difficulties, a number of speakers this morning spoke of the absence of a moderate middle in our debate today, in our politics, both in general and particular on immigration and citizenship issues. And I think we can begin to understand something of why that's developed. And when I speak across the country and I listen to Americans and I listen to immigrants, what I hear they want most is candor and transparency. There is a sense in which policy on immigration, nobody is talking straight, and we don't really know what's going on. So let's think about candor and transparency and some of the difficult issues. Senator Martinez this morning, Congressman Mazzoli wrestled with these 20 years ago. These are messy and difficult issues, and they have the difficult task of trying to forge something that's workable amongst disparate elements. But those difficulties are worth pausing on. Who can be against enforcing our laws, having better border security? And yet I ask you this, are we really prepared to sustain the money and the manpower that would go into really enforcing the border and internal laws? That's a lot of money. It's going to be a lot of manpower. And I don't see in our history that we have been willing to pay the price and the burden when the costs are so directly borne by us. We've never had to do this in our history. When we cut and limited immigration in 1924, it was a totally different story. And what about the collateral damage that will happen to many of these mixed families caught in between? And so Senator Martinez and others come along and they correctly say, part of what we have to do is relieve the pressure on the border. It's not just about what we do here, it's about changing things in such a way, like having a guest worker program that would relieve pressure on the border and allow people to come and go in a regular way. Now, this is a serious and important proposition today, but if you haven't heard it yet today, let me say it. And that is the experience of every country in human history, and our European brethren in particular, is that there is nothing as permanent as a temporary worker. And the reason is simple. The reason is simple. Because people come, they may come for economic reasons, they may come to make a better life, they have every intention of going back, but they settle in. Their children are born here. Their children are American citizens. They grow up here. They have ties to their home country, but they become part of the fabric of our social and civic life. Now, there are a lot of proposals on the table to try and make this work better, and I commend all that effort. But I think we have to be candid and transparent about the fact that it is, in fact, a Herculean task to try and manage this process. And I don't know about you, I've worked with the Immigration Service for 10 years now, and I have great respect for the men and women there. But this is a large and not particularly effective bureaucracy that is often not funded sufficiently to manage its load. So let's be serious if we're talking about this proposal, whether we're going to commit and being able to manage it. And then, of course, there's the question about what about our own complicity in this? What about the fact that whoever broke the law to come here, nonetheless, many of us benefited in one way or another, directly or indirectly? You know, if you go out with Border Patrol agents, they will tell you something very strange. They will tell you that if it was them on the other side of the border, they would be doing exactly the same thing. Now, think about that. If you went to a police officer in a major urban center or anywhere in this country and said, well, what do you think about drug dealers? Do you think they would say, oh, if I was in their situation, I'd do the same thing? No. I'm not saying violating the law is a minor issue, but I'm saying we think about it differently, and we ought to take a note from those on the front lines who think about it differently. Because this brings us to the final leg of enforcement and guest workers, and what about the 11 to 12 million undocumented workers who are here today? And here, of course, the proposal is for some form of legalization, some kind of amnesty in one way or another. And again, there are important debates there. And the difficulty here is that there are a lot of arguments you can see the plausibility, both ethical and practical, for doing so. And yet critics have a point. We did it 20 years ago, and we're going to do it again 20 years from now. Is it going to be a set of rolling amnesties? And if it's rolling amnesties, then haven't we effectively defaulted on our policy? Now, I say this with great